Hey, thanks for joining us again for our weekly online Bible study. We hope you'll be encouraged and blessed. Be sure to like and share this video to help spread the message of hope in Jesus. Now, let's open up our Bibles for today's Bible study.
Hey there, my name is Will, and I'm here to do a Bible study with you guys about Elijah. Now, there's a number of ways of doing Bible studies, but I think probably my most favorite way of doing Bible studies is really kind of taking a look at a specific story that probably involves a character in the Bible. And what I like to do is really sort of break down that story to try to get as many understandings around dynamics, influences, and those types of things that were going on for those individuals at that time. And so today, that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to share with you guys a little bit about Elijah and what I feel like are the four major things that we can learn from the story of Elijah. But before we actually get to Elijah, I want to try to help set a little bit of the history around what was going on in the nation of Israel leading up to Elijah. So if you read in the book of Exodus, we find out that Moses led the people from Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea, and then from there, they were led by God around the desert. And this is probably one of the first times that we see the nation of Israel being led by God as the king of the nation, just himself. During the daytime, there was a pillar of cloud that led them around the desert. During the nighttime, there was a pillar of fire that may have led them around the desert. And wherever they made up camp, Moses made sure to set up what he called the tent of meeting. And what he would do is he would go to the tent of meeting and he would talk to the Lord every day as man speaks with his friend, according to what the Bible says. The unique dynamic from that, is the fact that, we have a nation of people who have questions and challenges, and they're bringing them to Moses. Moses would talk to God, and then he would come back and give them instructions on how to respond to those problems and issues. So after taking over the promised land, which now we know that Joshua had gone and done that, God ruled the nation through a series of judges who provided direction much similar to Moses. So we might hear great stories about Deborah. I think also Samson was one of the judges. But still, the nation would have problems or challenges. The nation would go to these judges, and then from there, those judges would hear from God and then speak back to the nation. Then we go from after they took over the promised land, the nation began to ask and plead for a king. And this is where we start to see the dynamic shift in how God ruled the Israelites. And we also see how when this dynamic shifts to having a kingdom, now we start to see that there is more of an opportunity for the nation to deviate from God's laws and his instruction. The nation yearned for a king, so Samuel anoints Saul. Saul ended up having his issues, so Samuel anointed David as king because God chose to remove Saul as king. And then David crushes the neighboring countries with impressive military strategies through Samuel's instruction, which is pretty awesome. I mean, David was really divisive in how he went about taking on his battles. And every time before he would go into battle, he would consult with Samuel before moving into battle. After David, Solomon ushers in the golden age in which the nation of Israel saw its economic peak. And Solomon ruled for quite a while. He married a lot of, queens from around neighboring areas, princesses, in an effort to maintain peace because he was not a military person like his father. But we also see in that strategy, there's a level of things that pop up that create problems for that as well. After that, we see just a series of kings, right? And if kings decided to follow the ways of the Lord, the nation prospered. They did good. But if kings really kind of did things in their own way that they saw things, the nation wouldn't do so good. And in some cases, God would use other nations to punish the Israelites. So from this history, we can learn point number one, is that God isn't subject to the societal norms of our society, and that it's better for us to be influential rather than being influenced. So when we think about the societal norms, right, there's so many things that we look at that we care about, right? Social media is a really big thing today. And who's doing what, and a lot of people want to have the right or ability to express themselves through social media. There's fashion, right? Fashion is a very real part of what's happening in our society. And when we take a look at fashion, it doesn't really have any value, to be honest. Fashion is literally just between us as human beings. And we can see all these different things, but it's so much better to be influential rather than influenced by society. And assuming that God is behind you, if God is behind you, and you're clearly hearing from the word of the Lord, and you're stepping out under his instruction to influence the nation around you, you can do great and powerful things, much like Elijah did. What I like about Elijah is that, number one, he just didn't care what people thought about him. In fact, Elijah basically went grain in all of the things that I just mentioned before. First off, I consider Elijah kind of like a spiritual ninja. He came and went as he pleased. People really couldn't find him, and when even kings wanted to pull him in and have conversations with him about it, Elijah was just gone. He didn't show up unless he had a word from the Lord, which I thought was pretty awesome. He went where he pleased, and whenever he did show up, it was almost as if he would just miraculously show up, even sometimes getting past guards to talk to certain kings or certain important people in certain areas. He didn't fit into fashion at all. In fact, he wore rags and skins from animals because he lived in the wilderness, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And I'm pretty sure that if Elijah was here today, he might be that guy that wears socks with sandals because he doesn't care. And then lastly, he lived on the land by faith. For a good part of Elijah's life, he ate what the birds fed him or what others gave him. In the beginning, God told him to speak to the kings and say that he was going to bring about a drought, and that the drought wouldn't end until Elijah gave the word. And then he went out to the wilderness. Ravens would bring him bread and food and those types of things, and he drank the water from a creek that was nearby until that creek dried up. Then he ended up going into the town where he was fed by random people, mostly I think there was a story around a lady who she was giving her last meal to her and her son, and he multiplied the food that she made in order for them to be able to eat. And really, Elijah never really got to experience some of the great high-class culinary cuisines that we get to eat today. And for me, I love going to random restaurants. Fogo de Chao is my favorite restaurant, right? I love steaks, going to places like Ruth's Chris and all that sort of things. But Elijah, he never got to experience those sorts of things. He really kind of ate what was given to him, and he had a very simple diet. Point number two that we can learn from Elijah is that none of these things mattered because he had an intimate relationship with God. And I want you to imagine this. Imagine that you really don't go to work every day and interact with your friends. You don't turn your TV on every day and you just kind of engage in whatever type of entertainment that you engage into. Imagine being out in a forest where the only thing that you hear is the wind that blows through the trees, the random birds that are singing in the air, or perhaps random creatures that may roam through your space or your area of the forest. But you're out there in the silence. You're in the seclusion. And the only thing that you're doing is you're just listening and conversing with God. I think so many of us, so many times, we get so caught up in the things that are happening around us. Our nation is in turmoil right now. We're probably jumping into the news who knows how many times a day. We read these things about what the Republicans are doing and what the Democrats are doing, and we're so worried and we're so influenced by the dealings of man. And Elijah never had to deal with that. Man was doing its own thing, and he was out there having a very intimate and powerful relationship with the Lord. I think there's a lot that we can learn from that type of behavior. And I think that when we focus on God, the pressures and influences of the world, they just don't matter anymore. And that's because we know who he is. And once we know who God is, then we can learn who we are. And then we have the full confidence to basically execute in what we're capable of. I'll say this one more time. Because we know who he is, we know who we are. And we have full confidence in what we're capable of. And I think once we get into the story here, you'll see this really play out a lot for Elijah. So we're going to turn to 1 Kings 18. And we're going to start with verse 16. And this is the main story that I really want to share with everyone. And this is the showdown on Mount Carmel between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Now, in this time, Ahab was king, and Ahab was married to Jezebel. And Jezebel really wanted to turn the nation away from being led by God and being submissive to God to bringing in her own culture, which was the prophets of Baal. And Ahab, he was actually a pretty immature king. He was the kind of person that if he didn't get his way, he would whine about it. He was easily influenced. And Jezebel essentially ruled the nation through Ahab because he really didn't have much strength to stand on. So slowly, the nation was being overtaken and more influenced by the prophets of Baal. And eventually, Jezebel got to the point where she decided to kill off the prophets of God, forcing so many of them into hiding. And this is kind of where our story comes in. And so it says, Elijah on Mount Carmel. It says, so Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him and Ahab, and told him, so Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him what Elijah had said, which Elijah had said that as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today. So Obadiah goes and tells Ahab this, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, is that you, troubler of Israel? And it's interesting to think that King Ahab had become so influenced by Jezebel that he saw him as a nuisance, a person who came in and basically influenced his plans or, diverted some of the things that he was trying to do. He had no understanding that Elijah was a prophet, basically a voice of God Almighty himself. He was that far removed from what has been part of his own lineage and heritage in that land. And so Elijah replied to him, and he says, I have not made trouble for you. I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You've abandoned the Lord's commandments and have followed the Baals. Now, summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent word throughout Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. And so it says here, Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. And this response troubles me because it says the people said nothing. And I think that's kind of a little bit of an evidence of what was going on in the hearts of people. And this is the evidence of when we fall into a place of apathy. Apathy is a sense of being lukewarm, having no passion, not really aligning to anything or everything, and just kind of going with the flow of what's happening around us. And apathetic people were like, sure, maybe Baal's God, sure, maybe God's God, right? Like we might kind of dabble a little bit in both, but we see how that created this strong sense of apathy, so much so that when Elijah is saying there can't be both of these gods, there's one or the other. Choose who you'll choose today. They had no opinion on the matter. They never verbalized a single thing. And being so consumed by what was happening with them or what was happening around them, they never really took the time to pause and find out what's really going on around them and to know who to serve, to understand the hearts or the plans that any one of these gods would have, right? They didn't take any time to discover any one of those. And if they had remembered what God had done for the nation of Israel, they would have known who the real God was. And whether it came as a consequence or whether it came as a reward, they would have served the right God, which is God himself. So in verse 22, Elijah basically kicks it off and says this. So then Elijah said to them, he says, I'm the only one of the Lord's prophets left, which isn't true. But we could talk about why Elijah had that perspective later. But Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I'll prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. So at this point in time, all the people said, what you say is good. which if we were to translate that in today's times, it would be more like, seems legit. Sounds like a fair contest, a fair battle. So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, he says, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first. Since there are so many of you, call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given them and they prepared it. And so moving on through verse 26, it says, then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And then they danced around the altar that they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them and shouted and said, shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted even louder and slashed themselves with swords, spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response, no one answered, and no one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, come here to me. They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. And this is another sad thing that we can learn from this story, is that the altar of the Lord for the nation had been torn down. And Elijah actually had to replace it. There was so much apathy. There was such a lack of awareness that they were unaware of how far that they had strayed from God. There was no standard in their lives to determine, am I even moving away from God or am I moving towards God? And if I am moving away from God, how far have I moved away from him? And as we all know, the further and further we move away from God, then we also understand the more challenges that we have in our life. We're put more into a space of trying to resolve things on our own rather than getting divine wisdom from God to be able to navigate our challenging spaces through wisdom and authority that we get through the Holy Spirit. There's no fruit in our lives. Oftentimes we can just see ourselves kind of fading away in entertainment, which is what we see a lot of happening in our country today. Even Christians who come to church, sometimes they come to church to be entertained. Sometimes we go home and just watch TV or movies and we're just entertained. We clock in our jobs throughout the day and then clock out on our jobs at the end of the day just to come home and be entertained. There's so much happening around entertainment to the point where we idolize human beings who are celebrities and we place them on this special pedestal as if they've ascended to some higher rank when they're just as much of a human being as we are. Apathy is a symptom of being separated from God. And these people were desperately separated from God. So from there, it says that Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, which was customary to build an altar, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and the wood. They did it. And then he says, do it again, he said, and they did it again. And then he told them to do it a 3rd time, and they actually did it a 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even the trench. And this is where things kind of get really interesting, right? Because at this point in time, Elijah was sort of taunting the prophets of Baal before by making things. But now what he's doing is he's upping the ante. He doesn't even negotiate this with them. He just tells them, put more water on the altar, soak it down, because I know and I believe who my God is. And I know that my God is going to answer. In fact, that's how I knew to be here to even do this, because it came at the instruction of my God. Elijah had so much confidence that he was so willing to taunt these people because his confidence wasn't in his personality or his comedy and how much he can entertain other people. His confidence was in the Most High God, and that was awesome. And it was from that place that he taunted them. And then at the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you're turning their hearts back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. the Lord, he is God. And this brings us to point number 4 as I close this out. God moves through people, not because of people. And the prophets of Baal, they felt that if they did more to themselves or if they shouted louder, they could entice or incite their God to do something and to respond. But what they failed to understand is that God moves through people. And God moved through Elijah and burnt up the sacrifice. Elijah didn't do anything but set up the altar and had people water it, but it was the Lord himself who actually sent down the fire from heaven that burnt up the sacrifice. I think a lot of people are seeking the next big thing in Christianity, and be that, great church programs or worship teams. We hear a lot about people talking about revivals nowadays, and oftentimes people will say, well, come to my church. These are great things that's happening at my church. I'm saying, and no preacher, including myself, is greater than any other man. We put preachers sometimes even on pedestals, so much so that we put so much pressure on them that they can't even fail as human beings. And it's a tragic thing to happen. None of what's happening at your church really matters. Who your pastors are, if they're preaching dynamic messages, none of that stuff really matters. The only time those things begin to matter is when it brings us to the Lord and turns our hearts back to him again. And that's why we have to really remember and take ourselves out of the equation and remember that it's God who's pursuing his people and it's God who's moving through us because he wants to have a relationship with his people. It's all about God and how he connects with his people. And with that perspective, if we look at things in that light, we see the brokenness of humanity around us, which is really easy to see in today's day and age. There's a lot of brokenness happening around us everywhere. But when we see that brokenness, we can move towards people from a place of compassion. Compassion leads us. Compassion compels us to move towards the hurting and the broken and to influence them in such a way to where they can see healing and peace and restoration in their lives. But if we continue to focus on ourselves and continue to entertain ourselves from the spirit of apathy, the only way that we can move towards people is from a place of pride. And there's absolutely no authority in that at all. I really like thinking about the story of Elijah and visiting it from time to time. And I hope that this Bible study has really ministered to you and benefited you. If you have any questions, I do think it's good to reach out to your leadership teams and wherever you're at. Learn more, really read through the scripture, read through the chapters that go before it and even some of the chapters that follow after it. And then take some time to pray for your own self. Where do you see yourself moving away from the Lord, perhaps? Do you feel like you have a spirit of apathy, maybe from this place of seeking out entertainment all the time? And if so, you know where to go. Turn the TV off, close the door to the room, find a quiet place, get on your knees and pray. Seek the Lord out. Thanks for listening.